Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the roundtable today. It's a busy time for everyone. In June, there's a lot going on. We're doing this roundtable from our London office, but also joined by my colleague Colin from New York. So hello, New York. I'm going to hand over to Colin in a moment to moderate the session today. We are, have a record high participation today because I think that there's a lot of interest in looking, sort of taking a deeper look at where we are on the outcomes and ROI, use case mapping, and how to sort of think about this in terms of how to scale, go from POCs to scale. But just for those of you who are not so familiar with Evident and might be joining for the first time, I'm Alexandra Mousavisadeh, the co-founder and co-CEO of Evident. We produce the ranking of the 50 largest banks in North America and Europe, where we rank them according to their AI capabilities. We do an outside-in ranking, which is what you're seeing on the screen here. But we are also tracking outcomes and use case mapping from the inside out through direct participation with the banks. We track use cases so privately, and we also track use cases publicly. So before I hand over to Colin to guide us through the conversation today, maybe just a quick few words on just being 3 years in and having tracked in detail the activity on AI adoption across the banks in North America and Europe, and a few in APAC, and looking at this rapid change, and it's only accelerating further in terms of pace of activity, and also rethinking how to do this at scale and what it requires, not only from the enabler side, sort of talent and which innovation levers to pull, but really also from the operating model and thinking about how to do this at scale and how to organize for scale. So really what we want to focus on today is taking that view of how you move from this sort of individual use case or individual sort of POC view to looking at how to implement the strategies and get over the hurdles and the challenges that lie in front of one when thinking about doing this at scale down the lines of business, but also across functions of the bank itself. With that, I will hand over to Colin. Thank you very much, Colin.
Thanks, Alexandra. My name is Colin Gilbert. I'm the VP of Intelligence at Evident, and we're thrilled to welcome a rogues gallery of industry practitioners and subject matter experts from throughout the financial services community. Gentlemen, if I could have you each introduce yourself and who you represent in the order of the profile pics. Zachary, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Zachary Anderson. I'm the Chief Data and Analytics Officer and Head of AI for NatWest.
Welcome. Rohit?
Oh, I'm next. Yes, my name is Rohit Dhawan. I'm the Group Head of AI and the Chief AI Executive at Lloyds Banking Group.
You, Mudit?
I'll go next. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mudit Gupta. I'm a partner with EY. I lead our AI business for financial services consulting based out of New York.
Wonderful. And a special thank you to EY for sponsoring this event. We have a long working relationship going back to Symposium. So great to see you here, Mudit. And last but certainly not least, representing the North American contingent, Chandra.
Yeah, good morning and good evening. This is Chandra Capireddy. I'm the head of AI and advanced analytics at Truist. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Excellent. I'm always happy to have somebody in my New York time zone. So we appreciate you being here. Excellent. So given the amount of brainpower we have in the room, what we want to do today is get into the discussion questions as quickly as possible. We're going to organize today's session across 3 themes, which is number 1, where are we seeing AI use cases populate in the banks from an outside-in perspective? 2 is how banks are approaching scaling those promising use cases throughout and across the organizations by functional areas or across lines of business. And 3rd, and most importantly, we're going to have a discussion about how banks are approaching the ever-present topic of return on investment, and how even the definition of ROI is beginning to change as people move from deploying promising proofs of concept to scaling those individual use cases to talking increasingly about domains or value chains across everything that is going into the hopper. So very briefly, I'm going to tee up our first discussion by presenting a little bit of evidence data. All of what you'll see today is derived from our use case tracker. Huge shout out to my colleagues Gabriel and Molly, who have done a lot of the heavy lifting in this area of inquiry. So our use case tracker, which is available on the member hub, basically profiles every single new use case that we see being publicly disclosed by the banks tracked in the Evident AIQ index through a variety of channels. These include earnings calls, investor materials, press releases, and also, unlike the index itself, we look a lot at what's entering the ecosystem through news media outlets and the general press. At present, based on our last update, which was last week on Monday, we have 266 total use cases in the tracker. This covers 11 focus areas, 17 lines of business, and includes references to 55 implementation and technology partners. At present, when you look at that top line number, it's about 50-50 are Gen AI versus traditional AI or predictive AI applications when we try to categorize them. And the vast majority, or about 75%, are still internal or employee facing as opposed to externally or customer facing at the end of the day. When we drill down and compartmentalize the Gen AI use cases that are beginning to, cannibalize the overall share of the pie, these are the top 9 focus areas that we see coming to the forefront, and basically the split between whether or not they're customer facing or employee facing in the dark blue shading. So the top 9 are knowledge access, process automation, customer engagement, developer augmentation or code gen, customer analytics, risk management, fraud detection, trading, and data architecture. 2 quick notes on this data is 1, this is exclusively outside in and what's on the public record. And obviously there is a particular calculus of what use cases banks choose to disclose and what proprietary methods they do not choose to disclose. And second, 266 might seem like a big number, but that's basically just the tip of the iceberg of what we know is happening inside the banks at large. We know there are individual banks that obviously have north of 200, 300 use cases in isolation based on their reporting, but not all of those are getting detailed, especially with the metadata that we're looking for in terms of where that use case lies, what the focus area is, what the ROI is, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists for the first theme, which is where are the use cases? And I'm going to start with kind of our softball question, which is, does Evident's outside-in landscape of use case activity fit the narrative that banks are increasingly pursuing AI innovation in a very deliberate, very incremental manner? In other words, starting with low risk, high reward use cases and gradually laddering up the slope from there. I think I'll go first to Rohit and then and Zachary to take to have a view of whether or not we see it from the outside in dovetails with basically their privileged perspective from inside the banks. Rohit, do you want to take a first crack at this?
Yeah, thank you. I will. So I would broadly agree. I believe, that's where banks are in general. But when I look at what Lloyd's Banking Group is doing particularly, right, we are consolidating all our efforts around AI with not just necessarily incrementally building use cases, but like fundamentally reimagining our business with AI. And that's a very different mindset or a shift, right? Where, you are going from thinking about, how do I infuse or optimize the process with AI versus, how do I fundamentally reimagine the process with AI, which is, start with a clean sheet of paper and with knowing, what possibilities the new AI brings to the table. Take the opportunity to think about what this process or customer experience could look like, not now, but in 5 years from now. So the process is incremental, but within the realm of what we are doing at Lloyd's, we are taking those incremental steps to do something exponential eventually. So that's where Lloyd's Banking Group is at. But I would generally agree that a lot of the other banks that I see, or even like non-FS organizations, right? They are taking a bit more of a conservative approach to AI.
Excellent. Zachary, where's our data wrong?
I mean, I can definitely say there's some specific things, like we have many more in the fraud space than you're showing as a percentage here. We already have customer facing, so Core Plus, which is our internal chatbot, is leveraging generative AI use case or generative AI capabilities already. So there's a number of cases where we're really the minority.
Sounds good. And then, Chandra, we had an interesting.
I think,
oh, sorry.
Keep going, Zachary. We just lost you for a second.
Hello.
Yeah, no
Sorry
worries.
about that.
Yeah.
Please,
can you hear me now?
Finish your thoughts.
All right. Yeah, so I would say, I think when we started doing implementations on Gen AI a couple of years ago, we were very much in a use case by use case, looking at ROI and delivery on that. I'd say we've taken a pretty big shift in the last 8 months to start to reimagine pieces and really look at customer experiences in particular and how we might rebuild those entirely from front to back. So that's probably the shift in the last 8 months or 9 months. Not to mention agentic AI, which is kind of picking up from a lot of those individual use case areas.
Absolutely. And I know Alexandra is very eager for us to add that tagging in our analysis. So stay tuned for that.
You bet.
Chandra, we had an interesting conversation last week on which of those bars were under indexing or over indexing versus your gut instinct. And we talked a little bit about code gen. Can you follow through on that thought and maybe shift the conversation to where you're seeing the most exciting use cases, especially in terms of value generated?
Yeah, I think, thank you so much. I think, look, the outside in view that you had kind of shown the previous slide, the knowledge access, I think, that's bingo, right? I think, every single company has struggled to really extract the knowledge, the insights from the knowledge that's out there. And with the Gen AI, that's kind of the most popular use case, and which is really low risk. The data is already out there. It's unstructured, right? I think in a high reward, you get answers pretty quickly. I think there's the low hanging fruit, I think, without any question. But also, I think to finish off from a previous question, I think very quickly, where I think the use cases where it delivers value is when you have the full context. Not every use case can really have a context that you can readily provide to a large language model so you can actually respond. Context is super important. And so there are many use cases you have to struggle to really get the context to the large language model. And those are the use cases you have to be a little bit more careful. Don't expect return on investment on those very quickly. And the reward is going to be there in the long term. As Rohit said, some of those have to be built foundationally right now. But to me, that's kind of more important in terms of the knowledge access. I think that is bingo from a use case perspective, which is low hanging. But the code generation, I think, is another use case. Look, this it's not something new though. The Gen AI is definitely has really accelerated in how we can derive value in terms of really all the code productivity tools that are out there. GitHub Copilot has been there for some time. Previously we were using different techniques on how we can actually do the auto completions, and those are nothing new. But what has changed significantly is the training that has happened with the large language models with all the code bases, and pretty compelling right now on how the wipe coding is possible today. So imagine that, right? I think you don't have to be really even a developer to really build your application. As long as you understand what you're trying to do, you can actually build. So the code generation has significantly have improved in terms of really how you can use it not only to develop the code, but also refactoring the code and scanning the code, build and vulnerabilities, right, and code bugs and so on and so forth. I think that's something that I think, and I see a significant value. And in terms of really, going to the second question that you have there, where is the most exciting use cases? I think, I believe it's a Jackery or somebody mentioned very quickly on this call, the number one use case, most exciting for banking is a fraud. There is a traditional AI, there's generative AI. Traditional AI, we still have fraud use cases that are out there where I think we could significantly improve with the latest and greatest, AI on the traditional AI side of the equation. I'm talking about the check fraud. I'm talking about the plastic fraud. I'm talking about the digital fraud. I think that's the number one, I think I would say, use case that's very exciting. We still have to solve for. That's kind of more on the traditional AI side. But on the generative AI side, the most exciting use case, in addition to the productivity applications for the developers that we talked about in the code developer productivity, I would also think about the operational efficiencies. Now, wherever you have, from a banking perspective, AML operations, imagine all the documentation you have to do for KYC, super important. How can you use Gen AI to really do your customer due diligence documents? Even some of the SOR finding, the SOR filings, there's so on and so forth. The AML operations is super important area where we can actually use Gen AI. That's most exciting. And also the call center operations, all the transcripts that you actually, see, millions of calls, how do you really extract the signals that we're actually receiving from our customer call interactions? I think that's a significant area as well. So there are operational efficiencies bucket, I think is going to play a big role. And in terms of really, customer facing, your survey and your data point was spot on. I think we're not there yet to put the Gen AI in front of the customer. I think, to me, you definitely have to really, there's still a kind of an element of, reliability with the Gen AI. As we all know, that all models are wrong. Some are useful. All Gen AI models hallucinate. We got to really figure out how to really have a control on how we can display and relay the information to the customer if it's external facing. For internal facing, human in the loop, super important. So I think education and training. So those are the kinds of things that I think are exciting.
That's great. Mudit, as an advisor to a large cross-section of the banks represented in the index, I wanted to ask you the question, what are the key considerations when deciding kind of which areas of the business to deploy AI? And to contextualize that a little bit more, Chandra just gave us a very good synthesis of basically how the ROI is positioned kind of over different time scales. So another way of asking this question is, how do you balance what unlocks the most value versus what unlocks the quickest value, taking an iterative approach and balancing that short-term and long-term view? Thoughts?
Yeah, Colin, good question. Thank you. First of all, let me share this. In our work on AI, we have had to look at it with three lenses at EY. First lens is what was mentioned by some of the other panelists as well, which is employee productivity. So we had rolled out a chatbot functionality to our 400,000 employees globally to be able to start to have them interact and be more productive in their day-to-day activities, right? Second bucket is where, as we deliver work, execute work, transformation work, operations work for our clients, how do we bring AI in our delivery, right? So can we make our delivery better? Can we make our delivery efficient? Can we make it higher quality? And so on. And the third is certainly helping our clients directly, enabling and operationalizing AI, right? So these three lenses have been priority for us, over the last about 12 to 18 months. And across these three, we also had to go through our own journey of innovation, identifying use cases, right? Like others mentioned, right? So every function, every line of business we have found across the banks have had an innovation exercise and have had these set of use cases. They have done a set of prioritization, whether it's ROI based or otherwise, and they've also gone through a POC exercise. So let me offer these two simple buckets, and I know they're overly simplified here for a minute, right? I've just put the use case prioritization into two, so productivity and transformation, right? And I'll get to the question you asked in a second, right? productivity, if you look across the majority of the use cases, I think Chandra said this as well, a lot of it is around getting access to knowledge that you otherwise can't get to easily, right? Asking questions of that knowledge. Some of that knowledge is stuck in documents, some is stuck in chats, right? And so on. So can you get 30 to 50% efficiency gain, productivity gain by getting access? So productivity is number one, right? So things like automation, meeting automation, advisor meetings, right? And so on, knowledge management in the call center, compliance type activities, right? All of those activities. The second bucket I would put is transformation more broadly. This is harder, right? Higher level of complexity. This gets to revenue uplift type areas like fraud detection that was mentioned. And then when you talk about contact center, it's transformation of the contact center versus just productivity improvement of the agent, right? If you put AI or agentic AI at the center of how a contact center operates, and start to enable its transformation, right? It's going to require not just AI, it's going to require process improvements, right, overall, right? So those two buckets have helped us sort of simplify this, and I know we'll get to this a little bit later in the chat as well. It's not really one or the other. We've seen it's you tend to start with productivity because it's the low risk and medium to high risk, right? It's tangible. You can what you're doing is you're establishing proof points, right? So that when you get to the road of adoption, right, you start to have these proof points on that road of adoption, so you can truly get to transformation, right?
Yeah. And Mudit, a quick follow-up question, our first audience question. And by the way, we have a series of chat moderators that are feeding trending questions to both myself and Alexandra. So please feel free to chime in, and we'll do our best to raise those with the panelists. But one question we're getting from the audience, Mudit, is what about risk management, which is very low on our observability scale. And I wonder how you think about that in the context of your framework in terms of productivity versus transformation, because isn't the risk management in effect not separate, but baked in across like the entire spectrum, which is maybe why we don't always talk about it explicitly.
Yeah, that's a great question and very close to my heart. I've spent a lot of time in risk management in my career personally, and do that today as well. So in risk management, I would say the whole concept of first line, which is a business, second line, which is compliance, risk management functions, and third line, there is a lot of areas where having access to knowledge would be a huge productivity lift, right? Whether it's policies, procedures. Think about how much work and effort we all spend in our banking organizations on controls and demonstrating execution of controls, performance of controls, monitoring of controls, right? If I go to credit, right, there is a lot of monitoring of ongoing, your credit, profile, right? A periodic monitoring happens. You have certain attributes you're testing. If I go to reg reporting, I mean, I could continue, down, right? So risk management activities fit that definition quite well, actually, right? Where it's inward facing. It's also something you can get productivity improvements on to drive proof points. I believe that more proof points are in the works today than they were about a year ago. But I think there's still more work to be done to get to the transformation side, right? And there are two or three considerations I'd like to share, right, on this, Colin. So one is stakeholder alignment, I call it, right, which is essentially, look, it's a very nice, new technology, right? Certainly has a higher level of complexity than prior technologies, right? But do we truly have stakeholder alignment on the business purpose, on the benefit? Once you have the proof point, then what, right? That alignment is key to scale, right? Whether it's in risk management use cases or operations or developer productivity, right? Second is how much data is really necessary upfront for development, and how willing are you to provide access to that data, right? Let's assume for a minute data isolation is in place, controls are in place, it's all behind your firewall, right? Still within your own walls. And the third is, what's the tolerance for error, right? Some of the areas we're talking about here, like fraud detection, right? Like there is, there's, credit, there's very low tolerance for error or zero tolerance for error, right? How willing and what's the tolerance for error, right? So I'd offer these considerations to the audience as you think about the use cases in those two buckets and as you think about scale?
Absolutely. And I think that's a fantastic transition to obviously how you do scale and what considerations are factored into that. So
Can I quickly,
two more.
Hey, Colin,
Sorry,
quickly
Chandra,
add
go
a
ahead.
comment on to what Rohit said on the risk management. I think just want to add that look, risk management for traditional AI, I think has been in place for a long time. I think everybody understands MRM on SR 11.7 guidance, right? I think it's all about the effective challenge, conceptual soundness of the models, outcome analysis, ongoing monitoring. That's been rock solid. It's been proven. I think the risk management for generative AI applications, I think that's kind of maturing as we speak. And I'm sure, I think for folks who have seen a NIST AI risk management framework, which covers quite a bit on that. And also there's a generative AI profile. I think there's another kind of a good source. So when it comes to the risk, managing risk for the generative AI applications, the risk of hallucination, I think, is super critical. And the privacy explainability, becomes even more critical. I mean, privacy to a certain extent you can control with input controls and output controls, but the explainability piece, I think, is the hardest piece. I mean, it's very hard to explain the generative AI output. And really, I think that's kind of where industry is kind of maturing at this point. That's why we still emphasize human in the loop. And the reason why many of the Gen AI applications are not client facing is only because of that. So still, it's all internal, human in the loop, productivity type applications, or operational efficiency type applications, right? I think so. Risk management is critical. I'll tell you one more risk management principle that I think most banks are actually going through is how do we ensure that there's no over reliance on the AI outputs. So once you start using AI, especially the generative AI, and then you start believing in the output, and then you think that kind of reliance is going to stay in place for a longer period of time, that's the danger that we run into. So summarize a document, for example, or draft me an email. The first 5 times I look at carefully that email that I drafted using, for example, Copilot. I feel good about it, maybe slight corrections here and there. The 6th time, I don't even want to check. I simply draft email and send it, right? What happens if there's a clause that you don't want to, especially when you're sending emails to external clients? So over-reliance on the generative AI outputs is also a big risk. Constant training has to be in place. I think that's kind of another risk component, how we mitigate that risk by having the training component in the companies. I just want to add on to some of the risk management.
No, that's fantastic. And I think you really hit the nail on the head with regards to, we do see a massive investment in AI-specific research on explainability or XAI. But I think where that research ends and how much further it has to deliver is why we see this disjointed splint between internally versus externally facing use cases. And that's what also I think a lot of the data on this slide reinforces. On this slide, we're looking at all of our use cases on 2 axes, which is on the x-axis, the focus areas, and on the y-axis, the lines of business. And on a heat map basis, you can see just an intense concentration of nearly half or over half of these things that we're talking about in the public are closely isolated in the retail and personal banking segment. And that's a lot of the knowledge access or knowledge retrieval, and it's a lot of the customer service where there is a human that's standing in between. These are customer-facing tools, but there's a human in between the internal resource and how it lives externally. So I want to kind of shift the conversation now from where these use cases are to how we're scaling and how we're making these decisions based on the results that we're seeing. And just as the point of departure, when we try to categorize outcomes associated with these, over 200 use cases, I want to point out that only a third or less of them basically have outcomes attached to them. And 70% of those outcomes are efficiency gains. They're not risk reduction, they're not revenue uplift, they're not customer satisfaction. We're still in the early innings of defining this strictly from the perspective of efficiency. So when we think about how are banks thinking about going beyond individual use cases and thinking about everything they're doing in terms of AI tools, applications, models, and systems? I want to ask kind of the following provocations are, what are the key factors engaging where to expand? where to focus, where to change our investment. And some of the things we hear are, a lot of this is coming from the users. A lot of it is coming by how quickly we can move. A lot of it is coming back from small working groups in specialized areas. But Zachary, maybe we can go to you first and say, like, from your perspective at NatWest, when you have a similar mapping that you're looking at internally, how do you get outside of that box where you've had a lot of early success and make sure that that heat map starts glowing or flicking on across like everything that's under your purview?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things I'd say. So I think there's a reason why people tend to report cost savings, but not necessarily say revenue uplift. It's not like we're not internally, we are definitely tracking our revenue gains, our cost savings, our controls. We have a whole suite of applications that we've developed for the controls teams themselves, and exactly what was mentioned before, which also, by the way, has a great secondary impact of getting the controls teams comfortable with using AI and how AI can help improve our control environment. But I think, when you're impacting revenue, it's a multifaceted outcome. And that's why I think people are a little less likely to report it, because you'll see the revenue gains in the earnings. But it also has to do with your strategy, your products, everything that you're going to market with. And the AI stuff definitely can impact that, especially when you're doing control testing to be able to understand it. But it's just not likely to be reported in a direct line, I think. So when we're looking at our outcomes for AI, we think about all those factors that you talked about, even if that's not necessarily what we're reporting extra. Your question was really around, like, how are we deciding where to go and how do we broaden the impact? And we really have what I would call a lab and a crowd kind of model, which is what I unashamedly stole from Ethan Mollick, which is that we definitely have a core set of data scientists, data engineers that are working on the biggest, most difficult use cases. And increasingly, we're trying to think of them as like a forward engineering team. They're working on things that are at the edge of feasibility right now, because usually the models are improving so quickly, but by the time the project's done, that what was at the edge before is now in the core of possibility. And then we have a crowd. So we're increasingly making all of our Gen AI tools available to many of our developers, to many of our business users. We've recently rolled out our internal LLM tool suite to a very large portion of the users in the bank. And that's really picking up the breadth of use cases. Now, of course, they're registered and they're under control and they go through risk assessments. But it's really broadening the use cases. And we see really creative outcomes come out of those in ways, frankly, that I didn't think people would think of using the models, or I had never seen. And also kind of sometimes there's things that you don't think will work. I like to say the kind of feasible edge of what you can do with the models and the agents right now is not only increasing, but it's also jagged. Things you think you can do, you can't do, and things that you end up finding out that you can do surprise you sometimes. And with all 70,000 of our employees exploring that edge, we're mapping out the kind of efficient frontier in a much faster way than we were before. And so I think that's really broadening the usage and the use cases. And then that comes back and informs sometimes what we're doing in the core. So okay, we need to build a service that supports, say, a very large number of users doing evals, or we need to do other things that are blockers for that team, for the crowd to move quickly. But sometimes they also learn things that we're like, wow, that's a great use of the model. Let's harden that, make it available to everyone, and then roll it out across the group. And that's really a kind of great virtuous cycle that we're starting to see develop inside NatWest.
And well said. Rohit, same question with a little bit different phrasing is, how do you, especially when you're talking about Gen AI, LLMs, and RAG systems, how do you go from a very generalized solution to the specific needs of an individual line of business or an adjacent use case area? And on top of that, how do you incorporate the business's perspective on what these tools need to solve for that impacts like the bottom line versus what's technically interesting, technically feasible, or within the realm of possibility from the technical teams?
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I like, Zach's analogy of lab versus crowd, right? We probably have something similar. And for me, the only way you can scale is to enable others, right? So if you enable your builder community, your power users, and also, the rest of the business on essentially how they're going to be leveraging AI, right? As either a builder of AI or a consumer of AI or a sponsor of AI, then you can you can basically wait for these people to come up with new ideas, take the ownership of these use cases and deploy something at scale. So it's that fine balance between the level of centralization and decentralization, right? So yes, you got to have some central guardrails, governance, cadence, but at the same time, don't become a bottleneck for other people to deliver on the outcomes they want to deliver, right? Otherwise, people get frustrated and things don't move at pace. So that's a classic conundrum, right? It doesn't, and it's with everything else as well, right? But it's more relevant with AI and Gen AI because we want to move at a pace which is unprecedented, right? We have never seen this kind of pace before in the industry with any other technology. So AI is not like any other technology, right? Like the new AI, it's very different, and it's really going to be a game changer. Now, to your specific question, right? One guiding principle that we have is that for every use case, right, you got to have a nominated product owner from the business. I think that's really important. So, what we've done is, Lloyd's Banking Group has, a platform model, right, where, every capability is a platform. So there are, business aligned platforms, there are, internal platforms, and there are some enabling platforms. Like data and AI is an enabling platform, whereas, lending or mortgages could be a business platform. Now, depending on the use case, what we have done is, we have created these virtual squads, right, where you've got people from different platforms coming together. So platforms, deliver in their own squads, but now you have squads, that are cutting across, the horizontals. So create a vertical squad of people with representation from, both the business teams and the technology teams, which includes, data, AI, cloud services, security, architecture, so on and so forth. But make sure that the ultimate accountability of value realization rests on the business product owner, not the AI or data product owner. So I think that's a key consideration in how you ensure that value is being realized through Gen AI use cases.
I think that's a great best practice that we've heard anecdotally from a lot of the banks. Mudit, I want to go to you for one moment because you'll give me a straight answer to this question. And in a lot of third-party or academic literature, there's a whole subsection focused on emerging technologies that says that basically the use cases change dramatically depending on what economic environment you're operating in. So if it's good times, they're all focused on revenue gains. If it's bad times, they suddenly kind of switch to cost savings. And I think if I ask anybody else on the panel about which one of these is most important in the current operating environment, they'll say both. I think Zachary already did. So I'm interested in your perspective on where we are in that pendulum swing, or if it even applies in your world.
Yeah. Colin, it does 100%. And I would look at it as less of a pendulum, but it is truly a journey we continue to see. And I'll tell you why in a second, right? But the journey is the two buckets I talked earlier: productivity to transformation, right? Or you could change the term if you want, right? But basically, a set of areas where you can see quick benefit, mostly related to efficiency improvements, right? But look at them as proof points, a variety of proof points, both for stakeholders, the technology, the controls, right, risk management, on all those facets that were just discussed. These are all proof points. And as you continue to have established proof points, you can get to the transformation side of the house, right, where you can start to see higher complexity areas, right? But there are two key factors, right, on that road from or journey from productivity to transformation. First one is adoption. And I think this is an area that, in my view, gets trivialized quite a bit, right? And this adoption is truly about helping the business owners, helping the business users, right, be more savvy, be able to understand, be able to experiment, use, right? So I also call it as the literacy initiative, almost like, nobody has to be an expert on AI, but they've got to know it enough, and you got to give them time and bring them along, right, in that journey of adoption, right. It'll come from personal productivity. It'll come from just training, right, and just like any other new technology, you have to offer training, but this is not a new technology alone. This is going to become a way of life, right? So that adoption and the investment on adoption is huge. We are starting to see some banks actually take that very seriously and make some key investments into that, right? The second is I call them foundational capabilities, or also sometimes called as common capabilities, right? As you're building productivity proof points and you're dabbling into transformational type areas and use cases, you have to be thinking about what foundational capabilities you're putting in place so you can continue to achieve scale, right? For example, right, certainly an AI platform, but within that platform, how are you capturing knowledge, which is required to get your answers more accurate, right? And knowledge compounds, right? So are your users able to bring knowledge? Prompt libraries, are you able to bring them on a common platform? Can they be shared? I think Zach mentioned crowd, right? Is there a common way or to share some of these, right? And then if I even get into other things around code base and so on, can you know, we all are used to open source code, right? Can you also in-source code between various functions as it's being written, right? So these are, you know, models, right? Obviously, right? So these are foundational capabilities. If you don't invest in that and focus on that alongside these use cases, you'll have a challenge scaling very, very fast, right? So I think to your original question on the environment, certainly environment will always have an impact, but I would encourage that it's productivity to transformation and focus on those you know on those two areas.
Yeah. The audience has finally woken up, and we're getting a ton of really good questions, and they're all focused on ROI. So I want to move us to the last theme in short order. But Chandra, I have one last question that kind of dovetails with what Mudit just told us. Is like, when we return to the issue of risk management that you brought up, and whether or not that is a blocker or an accelerant to moving faster, I'd appreciate your thoughts, given the fact that, you know, in addition to Truist, you've worked at JP Morgan and Bank of America and Wells Fargo and a lot of places, and seen a lot of different ways that this has come together. I'm interested in your commentary on how important it is, or how the use cases are impacted on whether you're taking a very proprietary approach or whether you're trying to instill a culture of model agnosticism. And what are the various trade-offs between cost efficiency on the one hand and explainability, which you brought up yourself?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think, look, I mean, at Truist, we see model risk management as really more like a differentiator for us. I think of really driving a car without a brake versus driving a car with the brakes in it. Right. I think, you know, obviously you never want to drive a car if you even have a question whether the brakes work or not. I think, to me, the model risk management is like more like a braking system that must be in place. And I think, to me, that's more like a differentiator. I think, you know, when we look at really the implementation of AI in any company, the company that really does a good job of implementing AI is a company that really has a robust risk management practice in place. And it's not just to meet the regulatory expectations, but also really for banking, it's all about trust. It's all about credibility. I think, you know, we really do not have a good risk management practices. It's going to be a little harder. So to us, model risk management is really a critical step. And we take a very deliberate approach on how we kind of incorporate the model risk management in the whole AI lifecycle. So right from the AI use case ideation phase all the way through the development and testing, and to independent validation through ongoing monitoring. And how do we make that process much easier? And how do we make it easier for model risk management teams to assess the risk tier of the model? And how do we make sure that they can actually independent validate using an environment that they can actually do a thorough job of vetting that particular model? And especially for Gen AI applications, it's less of a model risk management. It's more of really, because there's not much to do about the model risk management there, because these are the foundation models sitting in the hyperscalers. either by Anthropic or Amazon or OpenAI, is mostly around the controls that we have in place for inputs and outputs. This is we use pretty much the APIs to access these models, and so model risk management is super important. I don't think they are a constraint; they're an enabler. I think the better we do with that, I think the faster we can really roll out our implementations where the true value is in terms of both the revenue as well as the cost savings.
Excellent. All right, gentlemen, let's address the elephant in the room, because 10 minutes should be perfectly sufficient time to unpack the ROI question. We've already talked about this at length, so I'm not going to use kind of the slides. But as Zachary very diplomatically pointed out, there's lots of ways to measure ROI. As a heavily regulated industry that has certain audit obligations, you don't always share all of the ROI stats in public, but we seem to be transitioning from individual measures to trying to unlock the basis of like the ROI formula, which is obviously net profit over cost, and how to ladder that up from use cases to lines of businesses to the organization at large. And so I'd like everybody's hot take on this first question, which really mirrors what we're hearing from the audience, is how is the measurement of ROI changing? And are you more focused on individual use cases, or are we, quote unquote, in the era of, as Alexandra coined the term, the death of the use cases, and really focusing on unlocking broader domains of value creation or systematic measures of that value when you look at the sum of its parts? Zachary, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, as I said before, I think actually it was easier to value ROI, and that was a much cleaner item. And in fact, the vast majority of our use cases had very good ROI that beat our hurdle rates. I think it's harder now that you're in the transformation phase, that you're looking at revenue and controls and a number of other factors to look at. But to me, it's part of what we do for every use case we develop, is track the value that's generated in the firm and sign off with the business stakeholders in whatever format that happens. Otherwise, it's just, otherwise it's not worth it. I mean, in the end, although the prices are dropping, you do have to pay for compute, you do have to pay for storage, you do have to pay for all of the infrastructure. It's bad business management if you don't have some sort of ROI on it. Now, I'd say the really tricky one is in some of the white collar use cases, like using co-pilots or things like that, to really figure out exactly what the total value is there. Because I'd say we're still all figuring out what the models are capable of and can do. But generally, the prices have come down so much on that now that I don't really mind too much. I can make a pretty good educated bet that the value's there as long as I see usage at a pretty high level. So to me, it's about really aligning with the stakeholders and the businesses to make sure that the value you're generating is worth it for them. In the end, in a bank, we all either bill back or allocate back to a P&L somewhere, and they have to see the value to accept it. So that it's a pretty easy, straightforward thing to me. I don't actually see as much of an issue as everybody else does. So.
Mudit, I was wondering if you could give the perspective of someone who's not looking inside the four walls of their organization, but talking to lots of clients against lots of different, across lots of different sectors. Does that experience kind of mirror what Zach was saying, or does it depend on who you're talking to? And most importantly, kind of putting this in at the historical perspective, there's a great question or observation from chat, which is, didn't we go through this with the internet and with mobile and with cloud? So why do we still get really trapped in narrow measures of ROI? Is it just the impatience of jumping ahead to what everybody agrees is the end goal or the end state of where we're headed next?
And I'd say data analytics is another example of historical analysis trying to generate ROI, or data mesh, or whichever one you want to pick from whichever generation. It's the same game.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment as well. I would urge folks to look at this differently, right? But it's going to be hard to change that mindset. I would 100% agree with that with that thought process, right? But as it comes to your question on ROI, right, and how the ROI is being looked at, Colin, right, use case versus broader, we're seeing a shift. We're seeing a shift where it's being looked at as broader domains, right? So I'll give you like a couple, 2 or 3 examples. I think customer service, if I look at that or customer engagement, if you think about it as a broad domain, and then you go within that domain and you look at the life cycle, right? If you just go to the contact center, right? Pre-call, during the call, post-call, customer engagement, compliance, right? Agent effectiveness. If I just put that life cycle out, right? How can you look at that entire life cycle and say, where is there large chunks of work, right? 50,000 hours, 100,000 hours, 200,000 hours, right? Like large chunks of work, where is that happening in that life cycle? And how can you then enable those chunks of work or, with both productivity improvements and transformational improvements, right? That's where the true ROI, we're starting to similar, thinking on the risk management. If I just, risk identification, risk assessment, risk measurement, risk monitoring, right? Like these are all, if you take that life cycle, where are risk functions spending time? So we are seeing that shift. We are seeing that shift quite a bit. Perhaps it's also driven by, proof points have been there. Banks are in or organizations are in the budgeting cycle for the next fiscal, right? So they're looking at and challenging the business and say, how can we further optimize, our processes? How can we further improve our business plan, right, going forward? So it's a very important shift that I think we're observing happening right now.
Rohit, over to you.
Yeah, just on that, right? One way to sell this, right, to our stakeholders, like management board, et cetera, is to, get them to think not just about the ROI, but also about 2 other ROs, right? Which I call, one is ROE, return on employee, right? Which is, Gen AI, like Copilot, et cetera, will be like email, tomorrow, kids coming out of university will expect it as part of their tool set, right? So, that's not an ROI conversation anymore. Like, you just got to have it. Everyone's got to have it. It's just a question of, the adoption curve, right? There will be some use cases that will deliver ROI in the short term, right? Your document processing ones, right? So on and so forth. And the third category is, what I call ROF, right? Return on future, because these are, your customer-facing long-term agentic use cases where you will not see any value in the next 2 or 3 years, right? As we are testing them out, we are building the customer propositions, but we need to still progress on building those out because, we need to understand the end-to-end, process and the architecture and the learnings in terms of, the risk, the regulatory framework, the compliance, the legal aspects of it to be able to experiment, right? And they may not produce an ROI for your, financial year planning cycle, right? So I think we just need to educate management on what these different categories mean and what AI will bring in the longer term for us.
Excellent. Chandra, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on this front, which is, while we're waiting for this to organically happen, what can you do proactively, especially in terms of process and people? Which stakeholders do you need to get in line to do the mapping process, the auditing process, and the reporting process so that you control but also ensure that this changing definition of ROI is highlighted up to the CFO level and present in publicly reported documents to the degree that you're able to do that?
Yeah, Colin, I think you said CFO. I think that's the first group that must be really engaged with calculating or even estimating ROI. I think there's a difference between estimation and calculation here. If you try and aim for perfection, I think you're going to be spinning your wheels. I don't think that's going to be very productive at the beginning of your use case kind of a life cycle. But as you really start investing dollars in it, I think obviously you probably have to make sure the business stakeholders are super important here in knowing how it's going to really impact. I mean, if you're implementing, for example, the easiest examples for everybody can comprehend is the fraud model. Let us say you really have an existing model. It's a champion model, and it really has, there's a level of fraud loss. And if you have a challenger model now, a new model, and how would that improve? Is it going to improve your reduction in fraud losses, or is it going to really remain the same? And how do you do it? It's a calculation, an experimentation that you have to do with the back testing, right? Take your historical data, right, and have your data run through those models, both champion models and challenger models, and see how it's going to, have a kind of a benefit. That's what is going to should reflect in the actual estimates on how it's going to look like. The stakeholders, the CFO group is super important. Start with them and make sure you have the right business stakeholders who truly understand some of the drivers behind these models and some of the users of these models and what metrics can be captured realistically. Be more realistic and don't overboil it, because it's very hard to really do this job. And at the end of the day, we all have, we always say this, right? All models, are wrong. Some are useful. 50% of the marketing spend, we don't know, how it's going to, show up. Similarly, you got to take a chance here around some of developing these models without knowing all the details in place. And more importantly, the C-suite should be clearly should be explained on the assumptions that you made in this ROI estimates. So CFO, line of business, and the C-suite, those are critical stakeholders, so we can continue to invest for the long-term returns, not for the short term.
Excellent. Given that required audience, I want to conclude with one lightning round question for each of you. And the answer, I just want to know whether it's the question we're asking the audience right now in polling is, based on everything we've heard over the last hour, do you expect to see more ROI reporting in the next 12 months, less reporting, or the same amount of reporting as we see now? And I'll go in the order of the panelists again. So Zach, more, less, or the same? More. Mudit?
No problem. Yeah, easy to say. More projects, more reporting.
More. I 100%
more.
agree with that.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
Chandra, come on.
So I'm going to say more. I think
More?
yes, more is because it's super important. I mean, I know you asked for a short answer very quickly. I think the investments that are required to be in this space will define the outcome of this for these banks, for the next 5 to 10 years. The current investments are critical, so ROI calculation is super critical. You'll see more of it kind of coming from the banks.
And Rohit, are you taking the dissenter view, or were you just a joiner?
Oh, no, yeah, I'm just a joiner. Absolutely.
All right. Just so you guys know, that the audience is full of much more pessimistic people. Only 23% said we'd see more reporting. Over half said it would be highly selective in terms of what we'd see over the course of the next year. So we'll see how this all plays out. Alexandra, back to you for housekeeping and to thank our esteemed panel of guests.
Yeah, I don't know how much housekeeping I will have time for, but really, most importantly, just huge thank you. Of course, we only scratch the surface on sessions like this, but the sessions are nonetheless really important because it does surface things that are top of mind for you, things that are top of mind for us, what we're seeing in the data, and for the audience to ask questions. There are so many good questions in the chat, and I know we didn't have time to get to many, but we will definitely take them on board and try and sort of have that sort of come through in some of the things that we're communicating for sure. So yes, we do have our index update coming up, the annual one in October 25, the 2025 Evident AI Index for Banks, which is really exciting. And for those of you who are not already participating in the private outcomes benchmark, where we map use cases and ROI, among many other things, the next wave, or the first official wave, will be rolling out late summer. But get in touch if you've got questions. It's so great to see everyone on screen and in the chat. And thank you also to EY for supporting us in this. Over to you, Colin.
Thanks, everybody, for your time and your efforts preparing for this session. It was a great discussion. We hope to see you again at a future event or in person. And last but not least, for the audience, in 2 weeks' time, we have our next roundtable where we will be debuting the results of our inaugural index focused on the 30 largest insurers across North America and Europe. We expect to see you there. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.